My name is Amber, and at 36. Look at her. Ethan chuckled, gesturing toward me as his friends leaned in. She actually believed the ring was a reward for love. You really thought I'd ever truly love a girl like you, Amber. You were just the lucky charm that kept the chairs warm while I climbed the ladder. The ice in my glass rattled the only sound I could make as the man I'd spent 7 years building a life with reached across the table to interlock his fingers with a woman who wasn't me. The rooftop air was expensive, but the words Ethan spat were cheap. The table erupted in a chorus of cruel, jagged laughter. I didn't scream. I didn't throw my drink. I did something far more terrifying. I smiled. I stood up, tucked a stray hair behind my ear, and walked away without looking back. They thought they were watching a woman defeated. They didn't realize they were watching the architect walk away from a building she'd rigged to explode. Because while Ethan was busy playing the alpha, he forgot one thing: I didn't just support his career. I designed it. Every strategy, every deal, every genius move that made him a star had my fingerprints on it. That night, before I even reached my front door, my phone buzzed with a call from the one person Ethan feared most, the billionaire CEO of his firm. Stay tuned, because what happens when the invisible woman stops being quiet will change everything. From a public betrayal that will make your blood boil to a corporate takedown so cold it'll leave you breathless. This is the story of how a man who thought he won it all lost everything to the woman he dared to laugh at. Keep watching. The real show is about to begin. I have spent the better part of a decade as a senior product manager, a role that requires me to foresee structural collapses long before they happen. For 7 years, I applied that same meticulous foresight to building Ethan's life, quietly smoothing the path for his meteoric rise in the corporate world, while I remained the steady, invisible foundation beneath his feet. I thought we were a team, a partnership forged in the late-night strategy sessions and the shared dreams of a future that felt just within reach. But as I stepped onto the mahogany deck of the Sky Lounge that evening, the air felt thin cold and dangerously predatory. The rooftop bar was a cathedral of glass and chrome perched 50 stories above the city, where the lights looked like scattered diamonds. It was a celebration for Ethan's promotion to executive vice president, a title I had practically written the roadmap for over 3 years of grueling market shifts. The room was packed with the city's elite men in $4,000 suits and women whose jewelry cost more than my first home. As we moved through the crowd, Ethan's hand stayed firmly in his pocket rather than finding the small of my back. He glided from one cluster of investors to another, his laughter booming, his charisma radiating like a heat lamp. Every time I stepped forward to join a conversation, he would subtly pivot his shoulder, physically carving me out of the circle. When an old colleague of his finally noticed me and asked who I was, Ethan didn't say "My Fiancé" or "the woman who made this possible." He took a long, leisurely sip of his Scotch eyes, dancing with a cruel light, and said, "This is Amber. She handles the domestic logistics. You know how it is. Everyone needs someone to make sure the plants stay watered and the coffee is hot." The condescension was so thick it felt like a physical weight. I stood there, my hand still holding the cocktail I no longer wanted, watching him diminish my life's work to the level of a housemaid in front of the very people I had helped him impress. He continued to pepper the night with small, jagged barbs, laughing about my quaint hobbies and my simple perspective on the industry, effectively painting me as a lucky tag-along who barely understood the world he inhabited. I watched him, my product manager's brain, involuntarily filing away the data of his betrayal. I realized then that he wasn't just being arrogant, he was rebranding himself. He was shedding his old skin, and in his new world, there was no room for the woman who knew where all his professional skeletons were buried. The atmosphere shifted from uncomfortable to toxic when Elena, a 24-year-old socialite whose father sat on the company's board, draped herself over Ethan's arm. Instead of pulling away, Ethan leaned in his fingers, tracing the rim of her glass. The flirtation was vulgar in its openness, a public performance of my displacement. Suddenly, Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, thrusting it toward me without even looking me in the eye. "Amber, be a dear and get a shot of us with the skyline in the background, will you? You've always had a better eye for the sidelines than the center stage." I took the phone. My hands didn't shake. I framed the shot the man I loved and the woman he was using to replace me and captured the moment his soul officially left the building. As I handed the phone back, one of Ethan's business partners, perhaps feeling a flicker of genuine pity, spoke up. "Careful there, Ethan. If you keep this up, you'll never make it to the altar. When is the big day, anyway?" The laughter at the table died down for a heartbeat waiting for his answer. Ethan didn't even flinch. He looked directly at me, a cold, mocking smirk twisting his handsome features, and let out a sharp, derisive bark of laughter. "The altar. You really thought I'd ever truly love a girl like you, Amber? Let's be real. She was just the lucky charm that kept the chairs warm while I worked my way up to the real prizes. Every king needs a peasant to remind him where he started, right?" The silence that followed was brief, quickly replaced by the forced, jagged laughter of people too afraid or too sycophantic to disagree. They laughed because Ethan was the man of the hour, and I was suddenly nobody. I felt the sting of 100 eyes on me waiting for the tears, the scream, the glass of wine thrown in his face. But they didn't know the Amber who had survived 20 years in the most cutthroat boardrooms in the country. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a scene. I didn't argue. I didn't even let my smile falter. Instead, I let that smile sharpen into something cold and clinical. I set my drink down on the table with a soft, deliberate click, adjusted my coat, and looked Ethan in the eye one last time. I didn't see a partner. I saw a failing asset. "Enjoy the rest of your evening, everyone," I said, my voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. I offered a polite nod to the CEO's daughter, turned on my heel, and walked toward the elevators. The laughter behind me started up again, but it sounded hollow now, muffled by the closing glass doors. I felt a strange, terrifying lightness in my chest. For 7 years, I had been the silent architect of his success, and in one night, he had handed me the demolition switch. As the elevator descended, I didn't cry. I simply began to mentally uncouple our shared servers, our shared data, and the intricate web of professional secrets that only I knew how to untangle. He thought he had discarded a tired old habit, but he had actually just evicted the only person who knew how to keep his world from collapsing. As I stepped out into the cold night air, the silence of the street was a relief after the cacophony of the rooftop. I began to walk, my heels clicking rhythmically against the pavement, a soldier marching away from a fallen fort. I hadn't even reached the corner when my phone vibrated in my clutch. I pulled it out, expecting a mocking text from Ethan or a fake apology. Instead, the screen displayed an unfamiliar number from the city's most prestigious and private area code, calling before the echoes of their laughter had even faded. The cold night air bit into my skin as I stood on the sidewalk, watching the light from the unfamiliar number fade into blackness on my screen. I didn't recognize the digits, but the weight of the moment told me that the universe was finally beginning to shift its gears. As I started the long walk toward my apartment, my mind began to drift backward, unspooling the 7 years of meticulous labor I had invested into a man who had just branded me a peasant. I remembered the early days of Ethan's career, back when his ambition was loud, but his execution was dangerously sloppy. He had the charm to open doors, but he lacked the intellectual stamina to stay inside the room. I was the one who stayed awake until 3 in the morning, fueled by lukewarm coffee and a sense of shared purpose, rewriting his flawed market analyses and identifying catastrophic risks he had completely overlooked in his haste for glory. Every time he stood before a podium to receive applause for a strategy I had perfected in the lonely hours of the night, I felt a swell of pride, foolishly believing that his success was our success. Ethan was masterful in how he handled me during those years. He never denied my work, but he carefully categorized it. He would kiss my forehead and tell me I was a wonderful helper, or that he couldn't have polished the presentation without me. He used diminutive language to frame my brilliance as mere assistance, a supportive domestic service, rather than a core contribution. He was conditioning me layer by layer to accept the shadows while he basked in the light, ensuring I felt like a silent partner in a firm where only his name was on the door. That conditioning had evolved into a more sinister form of corporate erasure over the last 6 months as the company prepared for its massive IPO. I started noticing small, chilling discrepancies in our daily professional rhythm. My name, once CIC'd on every high-level strategic thread, began to vanish from email chains. Meeting invites for the core leadership team would arrive for him while my calendar remained suspiciously empty. When I confronted him about it in the quiet of our home, his face would take on a mask of faux concern that I now recognize as pure gaslighting. He would tell me that I was getting too bogged down in the stress of the big picture, and that my real strength lay in the small administrative details. "You're great with the fine print, honey," he would say with a patronizing pat on my shoulder, "but you're just not leadership material. You don't have the stomach for the hard calls." It was a calculated psychological assault designed to make me doubt my own worth, ensuring that when the millions from the IPO finally hit, I would be too insecure to claim the equity I had earned with my own sweat and intellect. He wanted me to believe I was lucky to even be in the room, even though I was the one who had built the room itself. He was deleting my history, erasing the digital and professional footprints of the woman who had transformed him from a mid-level manager into a corporate titan. The realization of his true endgame hit me with the force of a physical blow as I walked past a bridal boutique, its windows dark and silent. The wedding delays that I had attributed to his crushing workload were never about the IPO or the stress of the merger. They were part of a strategic transition. I had found a stray folder on his laptop weeks ago, one he thought was encrypted, containing a dossier on Elena the socialite from the rooftop. She wasn't just a fling, she was a merger. Her father's seat on the board was the final piece of the puzzle Ethan needed to secure his permanent seat at the top. He had kept me around as a temporary scaffolding, a functional tool to get him through the most difficult phases of the company's growth, only to discard me once the structure was strong enough to stand without me. He didn't just break my heart. He attempted to commit professional identity theft planning to trade my 7 years of loyalty for a political alliance that would cement his legacy. I had been the bridge he used to cross the canyon, and now that he was on the other side, he was preparing to burn it while I was still standing on it. He thought I was a tragedy in the making, a jilted woman who would fade into the background of his success story. He had no idea that a senior product manager never builds a system without a back door, and I had left the keys to his kingdom right where I could find them. By the time I reached my front door, the phone rang a second time, and this time I didn't just look at the screen. I answered. I stood in the dim light of my foyer, the sound of my own breath ragged against the silence of an apartment that suddenly felt like a stranger's house. I slid the icon across the screen and pressed the phone to my ear, my voice sounding more grounded than I felt as I whispered a cautious hello. The voice that returned the greeting was instantly recognizable, a deep, gravelly baritone that commanded boardroom floors and shaped international markets. It was Marcus Sterling, the CEO of Ethan's firm, and a man known more for his ruthless efficiency than his personal touch. He didn't ask how I was doing, and he certainly didn't offer a single word of sympathy for the public execution of my dignity that had occurred only an hour prior on that rooftop. Instead, he bypassed all social niceties and cut straight into the heart of the matter with a precision that was almost surgical. He asked me a single, highly technical question regarding the recursive risk modeling algorithm I had built into the firm's 3-year expansion strategy. It was a detail so deeply buried in the architecture of the project, a hidden logic that governed the entire system's stability that no one who hadn't personally written the code could have possibly explained its function. In that moment, the power dynamic didn't just shift, it shattered. Sterling wasn't calling a jilted fiancé to offer a shoulder to cry on. He was calling the primary architect of his company's future, because he had realized the man he'd promoted was a decorative ornament. The validation hit me like a physical wave, steadying my hands and clearing the fog of humiliation from my mind as I realized that while Ethan had been busy erasing my name from the surface, he had failed to notice my intellectual signature, etched into the very bones of the company. Sterling spoke with the cold, calculating tone of a man who realized he had been sold a counterfeit product. He revealed that the firm was currently undergoing a high-stakes internal audit in preparation for the upcoming IPO, and the cracks were beginning to show in Ethan's supposed innovations. The systems I had built were failing to respond to Ethan's commands because Ethan didn't actually understand the fundamental principles of the logic I had woven into them. Sterling explained that he had spent the last several hours digging through the raw data logs and the early-stage white papers where he had discovered what he called my logic thumbprint. He saw the consistent patterns of thought, the unique way I structured data sets, and the unmistakable signature of a mind that looked 10 steps ahead, a mind that was clearly not Ethan's. He told me quite bluntly that he had come to the realization that Ethan was an empty vessel, a man who had spent 7 years skillfully translating my genius into a language the board could understand while keeping the source of that genius carefully hidden in the shadows. The CEO realized that the entire stability of the firm's valuation rested on a woman Ethan had spent the night mocking as a mere peasant. It was a sobering admission from a man like Sterling acknowledging that he had allowed a narcissist to play him for a fool while the real power was sitting at home watering the plants and making the coffee. The conversation took an even darker turn as Sterling outlined the gravity of the situation. He didn't promise to fire Ethan out of some noble sense of justice for my broken heart. He was a businessman, and his only loyalty was to the integrity of the firm. He needed an ethical witness, someone who could provide the documentation and the testimony necessary to prove that Ethan had committed professional fraud by misappropriating intellectual property. He laid out the stakes with brutal honesty, offering me a choice that felt like a crossroads for my entire life. I could stay silent, let the wedding stay canceled, and watch from the sidelines as the company eventually collapsed under the weight of Ethan's incompetence, likely taking the IPO and thousands of investors with it. Or I could come in from the cold, reclaim my identity as the lead strategist, and provide the evidence needed to strip Ethan of every title and accolade he had stolen from me. Sterling made it clear that this wasn't about a personal vendetta or a messy breakup. It was about whether I had the courage to step out of the domestic role Ethan had forced me into and claim my place on a global stage. He was offering me a seat at the table, not as Ethan's partner, but as his successor and his judge. I stood there in the dark, the city lights flickering outside my window, and I felt the last vestiges of my loyalty to Ethan dissolve into ash. This wasn't just about revenge, though the thought of seeing Ethan's face when the truth came out was undeniably sweet. It was about reclaiming the 7 years of my life that I had allowed him to treat as his own property. It was about the late nights, the missed holidays, and the thousands of hours I had poured into a future he had intended to steal. I realized that my value didn't come from my relationship with a rising star, but from the intellect that had made that star rise in the first place. Sterling stayed on the line, his silence a heavy expectant pressure, waiting to see if the woman Ethan had called a peasant had the iron will to become a queen. I knew that by saying yes, I was choosing a path that would destroy the life I had known, but it would finally be a life built on my own terms. I took a breath, the air finally feeling clear and sharp in my lungs. I told him I had the logs, the original drafts, and the encrypted files that proved every word of my claim. The weight of the world seemed to settle into a new, more balanced position as I felt the transition from victim to victor take root in my soul. Before hanging up, Sterling's voice turned ice cold. What happens next? Amber depends entirely on whether you're willing to let the truth do the screaming for you. In the days that followed Marcus Sterling's call, the atmosphere in our shared apartment took on a surreal, almost theatrical quality. Ethan returned from his nights out, smelling of expensive gin and Elena's perfume, his stride brimming with the insufferable confidence of a man who believed he had successfully performed a perfect social assassination. He interpreted my silence not as the tactical pause of an apex predator, but as the whimpering submission of a beaten dog. He became emboldened by his own perceived victory, speaking loudly on his phone about his new chapter and his high society trajectory as if I were a piece of furniture that had lost its utility. He reached a delusional peak of arrogance one evening when he tossed a lime green envelope onto the kitchen island while I was making tea. Inside was a check for $50,000, a severance payment he called it, intended to ensure I moved out quietly and didn't make a scene at the office or with his new circle. He stood there leaning against the counter with a smirk that made my skin crawl, telling me that he wanted to be fair despite my lack of leadership material. There was no flicker of remorse in his eyes, no recognition of the 7 years I had sacrificed to polish his dull edges into a shine that could fool a boardroom. He truly believed I was a broken woman, grateful for the crumbs of his success, completely unaware that I was merely counting the minutes until the trap I was setting snapped shut around his ankles. I leaned into his delusion with a performance that would have won an Oscar, initiating what I called my Trojan horse strategy. When Ethan began to panic about the final presentation for the board, a deep dive into the technical risks of the IPO that he lacked the intellect to navigate, I stepped back into my old role as his wonderful helper. I sat with him for hours, meticulously refining his slides and coaching him on the narrative, acting the part of the devoted, discarded partner who just wanted him to succeed one last time. He was so blinded by his own ego, so convinced of my inherent inferiority, that he didn't even notice the catastrophic flaw I had woven into the heart of the presentation. I intentionally omitted a critical explanation for a high-risk variable in the leverage projection's a massive debt-to-equity vulnerability that looked like a minor rounding error on the surface, but was actually a ticking time bomb for the company's valuation. I knew Ethan was far too lazy to verify the math himself, and his arrogance ensured he would never ask a second question as long as the graphs looked impressive. I was essentially handing him a gold-plated rope and watching with a quiet, icy satisfaction as he joyfully began to tie the noose around his own neck, all while thanking me for my loyalty to the mission. While Ethan was busy rehearsing his triumph in front of the mirror, I was leading a double life. I met with Marcus Sterling in a series of sterile offsite offices presenting the evidence of Ethan's fraud with the clinical precision of an autopsy. I showed him the original timestamps on my drafts, the encrypted logs of every strategy I had built from scratch, and the digital paper trail that proved Ethan had done nothing more than add his signature to my brilliance. I spoke without emotion, my voice as cold as the data I was providing, refusing to let my personal hurt cloud the professional execution of his downfall. Sterling watched me with a growing sense of grim realization, acknowledging that the very culture of his company, a culture that prioritized charismatic frontmen over the quiet architects in the background, was exactly what had allowed a parasite like Ethan to thrive at the expense of the firm's integrity. He saw that my revenge wasn't an act of spite, but a necessary cleansing of a corrupted system that had mistaken Ethan's narcissism for talent. We worked in a silence that was heavy with the weight of what was coming, two professionals preparing to excise a tumor before it could kill the body of the firm. On the final night before the presentation, Ethan actually had the nerve to toast me with a glass of champagne, telling me that once he was EVP and married into the board, he'd put in a good word for me at a smaller firm where I could handle the simpler stuff. I smiled back at him, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, and told him that he deserved exactly what was coming to him. He laughed, thinking I was being sentimental, and went to bed to dream of his impending glory. I stayed up not to help him, but to watch the clock. I felt a strange humming energy in my veins, the thrill of a woman who had spent a decade being told she was a peasant finally realizing she was the only one who knew how the castle worked. I didn't need to scream to be heard. I just needed to wait for the platform to be high enough so that when Ethan fell, there would be no doubt about who had pulled the lever. The transition was complete. The invisible foundation was about to become the entire structure. The company-wide meeting invite hit my inbox the next morning. His name was at the bottom as the presenter, but mine was listed at the top as the auditor. The morning of the board presentation, the air in the firm's glass-walled conference room was thick with the scent of expensive coffee and the palpable electricity of an impending IPO. I sat in the back row, a ghost in a sharp charcoal suit, watching as the same group of men who had laughed at me on the rooftop took their seats with expectant expressions. Elena was there too, sitting in the front row like a trophy already claimed her presence, a silent testament to Ethan's intended future. When Ethan stepped to the podium, he looked every bit the corporate savior he had spent 7 years pretending to be. He caught my eye for a fleeting second and gave a minute, arrogant nod as if to say, "Watch me win." He began the presentation with his usual flair, sliding through the early metrics I had prepared for him with a smooth, rehearsed confidence. However, the atmosphere shifted the moment a senior investor from a major European hedge fund leaned forward and asked a pointed, highly technical question about the high-risk leverage variable I had planted in the third-quarter projections. Ethan paused, his smile faltering as he realized he didn't even recognize the terminology. He began to stammer, throwing out vague buzzwords and trying to redirect the conversation, but the investor was relentless, demanding to know how the debt-to-equity ratio remained stable under the stress test parameters. In a moment of sheer desperate habit, Ethan turned his head toward the back of the room, his eyes pleading with me to bail him out as I had 1,000 times before. He waited for the whisper, the signal the note passed under the table that would save his skin. But this time, I didn't move. I simply sat there with my hands folded, meeting his panicked gaze with a polite, vacant smile that told him he was finally utterly on his own. The stumbling grew into a full-scale collapse. Ethan tried to deflect by citing a specific internal audit, but in his confusion he began to contradict the very emails and forged documents he had submitted to the board only days earlier. The more he spoke, the deeper he dug the grave of his own credibility. Just as the room began to murmur with unease, Marcus Sterling stood up from the head of the table. The silence that followed was deafening. Sterling didn't look at the podium, he looked at me. He informed the board that the strategy being presented was so riddled with foundational errors that it had already been flagged for immediate rejection by the firm's newly appointed lead consultant, Amber. A wave of audible gasps rippled through the room. The friends who had mocked me as a lucky charm, or a peasant, suddenly looked at me with wide, horrified eyes, their laughter from the rooftop bar coming back to haunt them in the cold light of the boardroom. Sterling projected my original encrypted drafts onto the screen, showing the room the massive discrepancy between my actual data and the distorted version Ethan had tried to pass off as his own. The revelation of the fraud was so total, so undeniable, that the air seemed to leave the room. The people who had been betting on Ethan's meteoric rise realized in a heartbeat that they had been gambling on an empty shell, and the woman they had treated as an invisible accessory was the only reason the company still had a pulse. The final hammer blow fell with a chilling efficiency. Sterling didn't bother with a long lecture on ethics. He simply signaled to the two security officers waiting by the door. Ethan's face went from pale to a sickly ashen gray as he realized what was happening. He was informed that he was being placed under immediate suspension for professional misconduct and the misappropriation of intellectual property pending a full legal investigation. The charisma that had been his only true currency evaporated, leaving behind a small, frightened man who began to lash out in a frantic, undignified rage. He pointed a trembling finger at me, shouting to the room that I had set him up, that I had intentionally sabotaged the presentation because I was a bitter, jilted woman who couldn't handle being left behind. The room remained suffocatingly quiet as Sterling walked toward the podium. He leaned into the microphone and spoke with a calm, devastating clarity that silenced Ethan's screams. He pointed out that if Ethan had actually performed the work he claimed as his own, if he had even a basic understanding of the systems he purported to lead, he could never have been set up by a set of numbers. The humiliation was total because it was rooted entirely in Ethan's own lack of ability. He had been exposed not by my malice, but by his own incompetence. The security guards stepped forward, each taking one of Ethan's arms to lead him out. The sound of his expensive leather shoes scuffing against the carpet was the only sound in the room as he was paraded past the board members and the investors he had tried to swindle. Elena had already turned her chair away from him, her eyes fixed on the floor. Her father's face a mask of cold fury. Ethan looked like a man who had been stripped naked in a snowstorm. The weight of his descent was so heavy it seemed to pull the very light from the room. As they led him past my chair, the guards paused for a moment to navigate the narrow aisle. Ethan stopped, his body shaking, his eyes bloodshot and searching mine for some remnant of the woman who had loved him, the woman who had been his invisible shield for 7 years. He leaned in his breath, smelling of stale coffee and desperation, his face pale and trembling to ask the one question he should have asked 10 years ago. Ethan whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "How long have you been waiting to destroy me?" I didn't answer him. I didn't need to. The answer was written in the silence of the room and the steady beat of my own heart. I hadn't been waiting to destroy him, I had simply stopped holding him up. As the security guards pulled him away, his question hung in the air, the final gasp of a man who still believed the world revolved around his ego. The weeks that followed brought a slow, agonizing burn for Ethan that was far more devastating than any courtroom drama. In the tight-knit, high-stakes circles of the American corporate world, a reputation for incompetence is a death sentence, but a reputation for intellectual fraud is an erasure. He wasn't sent to a prison of iron bars, but he was locked in a prison of his own making. Elena's father ensured that every door in the city was slammed shut before Ethan could even reach the handle. His socialite fiancé didn't just leave him. She scrubbed every trace of him from her life within 48 hours, moving on to a reality where he was nothing more than a footnote of bad judgment. He lost the penthouse, the cars, and the sycophants who had laughed at his jokes on the rooftop. For a man who defined his entire existence through the lens of status and the envy of others, becoming a social pariah was a fate far more painful than bankruptcy. He became a cautionary tale whispered in the elevators of firms he would never step foot in again, a man who had mistaken a woman's silence for a lack of power and paid for that mistake with his entire life. In the wake of the scandal, Marcus Sterling called me into his office, the same room where Ethan had once preened like a king. The CEO sat across from me, his expression uncharacteristically warm, as he laid out a formal offer that most people in my industry would spend a lifetime chasing. He offered me Ethan's old position, but with a significantly higher title and an equity package that would have made me one of the wealthiest women in the firm. He spoke about the new era of the company and how my leadership was the only way to restore the trust of the investors before the IPO. It was the ultimate validation, the moment I had dreamt of during those 3 o'clock in the morning strategy sessions when I was still trying to prove my worth to a man who would never see it. But as I looked around that mahogany-paneled room, I realized that the environment which had allowed Ethan to steal my light for 7 years was not the environment where I wanted to shine. The culture of the front man and the invisible architect was built into the very foundation of the firm, and I had no desire to spend my energy trying to fix a broken house when I had the blueprints to build my own. I made a radical choice that caught even Sterling off guard. I declined the offer. I thanked him for the recognition, but I told him that I was moving on to start my own consultancy firm, one built on the values of transparency, ethical data, and the radical idea that the person who does the work should be the one who gets the credit. I walked out of that building for the last time with a sense of peace that I hadn't felt since I was a child. I wasn't just a survivor of Ethan's narcissism. I was a leader who had finally recognized her own authority. The peasant had left the castle not because she was banished, but because she realized she owned the land the castle was built on. Over the next year, my firm grew at a rate that surprised everyone but me. I didn't need to bark orders or perform for a boardroom to be heard. My work spoke with a clarity that drew the most prestigious and ethical clients in the country to my door. They didn't come to me because I was a lucky charm. They came because they knew that when I designed a system, it wouldn't collapse when the pressure mounted. I took the lessons of my silence and turned them into the pillars of my success, ensuring that every woman who worked for me was seen, heard, and compensated for the brilliance she brought to the table. I realized that the greatest revenge wasn't seeing Ethan suffer, but reaching a point where his existence didn't matter to me at all. My healing didn't come from his fall, but from my own rise into a version of myself that no longer needed anyone else's permission to exist. Last night, I hosted an event to celebrate the first anniversary of my firm. It was held on a rooftop, much like the one where my world had supposedly ended a year ago. But this time, the atmosphere was entirely different. The air was warm, filled with the genuine laughter of people who respected one another and the hum of conversations that didn't require anyone to be made small for the sake of an ego. I stood at the edge of the glass railing, looking out at the city lights that once felt so cold and exclusionary. I realized that I was no longer an accessory or a domestic logistician. I was the host of my own life. I looked around the room at my team, my clients, and the friends who had stood by me when I finally decided to step out of the shadows. I felt a deep, resonant clarity about the journey I had taken. I had spent 7 years whispering so that a small man could feel tall, but in the end, it was my silence that had been the loudest thing in the room. Winning wasn't about staying in a toxic game and trying to change the rules. It was about having the brilliance to walk away and let the truth do the work for you. I took a sip of my drink, the ice rattling softly in the glass, and I smiled, not for a camera and certainly not for a man, but for myself. Some women scream to be heard. I simply stepped aside and let the truth speak for itself. Thank you for following Amber's journey from the shadows of betrayal to the pinnacle of her own success. This story serves as a powerful reminder that your value is not defined by those who fail to see it, and that silence can often be the most strategic weapon in a world full of noise. If you found Amber's resilience inspiring and enjoyed seeing the truth finally come to light, please consider subscribing to the channel. By joining our community, you will never miss a story of justice, empowerment, and the incredible strength of the human spirit. We want to hear from you as well. What did you think of Amber's radical choice to turn down the CEO's offer and start her own firm? Would you have taken the high-level position, or would you have walked away to build something of your own, just like she did? Do you believe Ethan's corporate unpersoning was a fitting punishment for his years of gaslighting and theft? Share your thoughts and personal experiences in the comments below. Your insights and opinions help spark vital conversations and bring our community closer together. Thank you for watching, and remember that sometimes the best way to win is simply to let the truth speak for itself.